Hola, buenos días. Hello, good morning to everyone. Today is our third day to our wonderful congress, I hope. And the third talk, the third keynote speaker is in charge to Professor Lake Sagaris, who, of course, doesn't need any introduction additionally. Please, Lake, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a bit of a surprise when I got the invitation, but now that I'm here and I'm reencontrándome, finding so many old friends here who I hadn't seen for many years, it's wonderful, and I'm very happy to be here. So, a note about my clothes. I was in a real doubt about what I should wear today. So, from the waist down, this is the way I dress to work, to empower communities and to generate a more equal kind of relationship. And from the waist up, I wanted to honor you and your professionalism and so on. So I'm a little more formal. This is the best I can do, so I hope it's acceptable. So on that note, I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to go through some things quite quickly, but I think it picks up from where a lot of the presentations over the past 3 days ended, which is sort of, what do we do with all this? Where are we going with all this? How do we influence the policy world? And above all, how do we influence people more based on the best evidence and not what is happening today in many places on the worst evidence? So the idea is to talk a bit more, and I'm a planner, not an engineer, so planners are always involved in politics and policy and power, and we're told when we're trained that we should speak truth to power, which isn't always a welcome position, but we do the best we can. And oh, it worked when I tested it. There. Okay. So I do participatory action research, and I'm going to talk a bit about what that is, because a lot of people seem to think, oh, that's qualitative research, and actually it's a little more and a little different from that. And I publish, and I publish with a lot of alliances, interdisciplinary journals and partners and so on. And what I'm really doing in my research and what we do in our laboratory for social change and with the affiliated researchers is, rather than simply describing or identifying the panoramic of what is happening, we're really looking at how to make change happen. So we're not looking so much at the what, we're looking at the how change happens. And most recently, what we're really looking at is how to put good research to work in the real world. So we're not so much interested in our own research and making it known, although that is part of the equation. We're really interested in bringing the best of what's known now. There's a huge body of evidence about sustainability and just sustainabilities that we want to bring much more into debate. So we're really focusing nowadays on bridging the abyss, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this in how practical and how messy it is as well between these two knowledge systems. And they're both knowledge systems. It's not that we know everything in academics and community knowledge systems are bankrupt. They know a lot. And when we don't connect the two, when we don't connect our knowledge to their knowledge and their knowledge to our knowledge, we get into trouble. So I'm just going to take a trip through sort of methods and some basic principles, and then I'm going to talk about a practical experiment, and then about where we go based on that practical experiment. And actually, of the 4 starting principles, one is mainly sort of methodological basis. So when we do research, we're looking a lot, we do the typical literature review, so we've sort of got a sense of what we know, where we're at. We can look around, we can do field work, we can see where we're at. But what we really want to know is, what does this mean? How can we put it to work? And I've got to say that we learn more from our failures. So we have to be brave. And that's not so easy. But we have to do it that way. And also that we have to be really humble, which is part of learning from your failures and acknowledging them, because we actually learn a lot more than we teach, even though we go into things saying, no, I know everything about sustainable transport today or land use or whatever. Nah, we never do. We never know everything. We never know exactly the right thing. So it's really important to understand that we use both quantitative and qualitative methods. We pair a lot. Ignacio's here. You'll see his name in some of my slides. We pair a lot with quantitative scholars, but we also do a lot of qualitative. But what we mostly do, which is quite different, is think about these results and what do they mean and why they happened. We build partnerships, and over the years the partnerships build and build and build. So we have partnerships that are 20 or 30 years old now. In fact, come from when I was a humble activist and never even thought I'd go into academics. So democratic values are really important. Equity, tolerance, respect. Not easy, especially when you think, oh, I just have to tell them this fact and they'll understand why we're doing it this way and not that way. Well, no, shut up and listen. And I have to say that my members of my neighborhood association in Bella Vista are very happy to tell me to shut up and that I talk too much on a pretty regular basis. So we're always going from some version of something we've received or we've seen or we've liked, and we think it's a possibility, to a local version or a regional version. So you'll see the Danish Cycling Lab made this a Christmas present one year, and when we did participatory action research and participation in the regional transport plan in Temuco in southern Chile, we had to add the oxen and the motemai and other kinds of mobile sales units. And this kind of translation and transition happens in every project. So under the hood, just very quickly, we're really influenced by Flicksberg and his thinking about how to make social sciences useful, how to make them matter, and particularly the ethical component of knowledge, although it really helps to understand that engineering, for example, is more in techne, while and crosses into episteme, etc. But just so you know, that's behind it. And Gaventa and Cornwell as well have a really good formulation of why who controls knowledge is important. When people don't feel participant of the creation of knowledge, it's not theirs. And it may be an appropriation of their knowledge, which a lot of more conventional research actually is. And it can exclude them from debates where they have contributed, but their voices haven't really weighed on decisions. There's also a lot of pedagogy here, and so again, we're valuing every stage of learning. And in fact, I may be an advanced expert in some areas, but I'm a novice when I come to a new neighborhood or a new city. And I always have to recognize that and understand that someone who may be a novice on transport and land use issues is actually an intuitive expert on their own neighborhood, what works, what doesn't work, what they believe in, what they don't believe in. So in terms of participatory action research, there's a whole spectrum, and I won't go into it, but I will say that we're basically at this end of the spectrum with a lot of community involvement, a lot of the community telling us what to do, telling us what they like, telling us what they don't like, and not really willing to participate in any kind of classical research space. They want to do things their way in their neighborhoods. So there's also here, what we always try to do are insider-outsider collaborations, because that's a way of kind of controlling, because obviously if you're an insider, the way I usually am in many of these studies, I have all the benefits of intimate knowledge, but I don't have the external view. So that's where our fellow researchers come in and who don't know the neighborhood or haven't really done this before or like what we're doing but have their own ideas about how to do participatory or action research. So the way that we do that is we build these circles of participation. And again, each circle is equally valued. I remember when we were fighting the highway project, I learned this, that Juan de Dios Ortúzar, a very well-known transport engineer, he used to follow us all the time, and every once in a while he'd just send us a message and say, you should say this, or you're missing that, or you know, you really should refer to Mogridge, for example. And he was a total outsider, but a really major contribution with that. And that's what happens. You don't have to be a member of the core group to have something really important to say and do. So one of the weird things about this, and Ignacio and I had a really hard time because we'd done all this gender and transport related research, and we realized there were kind of cumulative lessons. So it wasn't just sort of one research project, one set of results, one research project, one set of results. They were taking us along a path that was emerging as we went along. So, and this was almost 10 years of research that we did that started with sort of, let's just go out and look around, see what's happening on transportation. Then realizing that women weren't involved, they weren't considered as part of transportation in any way, shape, or form. And so we started to look at gender, and we started to look at gender with a study, again, with a questionnaire, with a survey, in 3 very different areas of Santiago to capture socioeconomic differences, and also with reflective workshops, which are a little deeper than focus groups, and which seek to build knowledge that lasts within the people who participate in them. We don't just have people participate, give us their opinions, and leave. We want to leave them with something that's going to shape their practice in the days to come. So gender led us to transport justice. This was around the time that Carol Martins was publishing his book, and we were really interested in how that bore out. But we were also looking, because the gender role differences start with children from 6 to 12. And so we also started looking at gender through a Cool Roots program. It started as a Safe Roots program, but because it was participatory, it went through a lot of changes. And more recently, because our research cluster is a big fan of complete streets, we started looking at, but wait a minute, you know, just because automobility as an ideology comes from the global north and is a problem in Chile, can we just copy-paste responses, or do we need to really interrogate what we're doing when we attempt to respond to automobility? So we did some workshops with Martín Tironi and Rosana Forray, design and architecture. And of course, yeah, this picture may look a little similar to a complete streets image, but the markets, especially now, when they're full of desperate people who are trying to survive and who are very stigmatized for that, brings a whole different idea of what's happening on sidewalks and what should happen on sidewalks. And one of the participants from Pudahuel, quite a poor neighborhood or area of Santiago, brought this picture and he said, streets are really important for demonstrations. Even if it's a small demonstration, it's really important to have that function and to recognize it. So these were some of the differences we started to see. And just for Cool Roots to School, we did it for about 4 years. We did it with a gender focus. It started out with sort of, oh, let's take Safe Routes to School and see how it applies in Chile. And because we did it in a participatory way, it was really transformed and became, the children themselves said, no queremos rutas seguras, queremos rutas bacanes. We want cool routes. We want fantastic routes and to school. And so it has a strong gender focus. It has a walk, bike, bus focus. So we took the kids, for example, to the control center for the Santiago public transport system and did a million other things. And it was really, really an education for all of us who thought we knew something about what we were doing. We were learning all the time from the children and later adolescents and their families. But above all, and I take this as the main lesson, and it just echoes and echoes through everything I do now, and that is that road safety isn't where it's at. When we teach road safety alone, we're teaching children to accept a subordinate position in a very dysfunctional system. We want to teach them survival skills. We don't want anyone to die or be injured because we're encouraging them to use active transport. And I include public transport there because you have to walk to get to public transport. Yeah, we don't want any of them to suffer, but we also want them to learn to question and to act on what is a very dysfunctional environment that they live in. And this, of course, is we use art, we use painting. These are bus signs that the kids themselves were painting, and so on. So we ended up with a very different program just because it was a participatory program. The children had the say, their say, the teachers had a say, the supervisors had a say. There were problems with violence and so on, and I'll talk about that in a few more minutes. So when we started, because we came to transport justice through a gender lens, we started with Ella se mueve segura, women, security, and public transport, one of the first studies, if not the first study in Latin America. We came to transport justice already with quite an interesting set of luggage. So one of the principles about sustainability and active transport, especially in transport and health, which is a space I work in a lot, active transport, walking, cycling, public transport, tends to be reduced to physical activity. It's not. And it's not sports. I hate sports, but I walk and cycle and bus everywhere. I hate sports. Sports, you're making an effort, you're stretching yourself to the limit, you're sweating, you're abusing your body and a lot. That's not for me. I ride a bike because I'm lazy, but it works. So the thing about cycling, and this is evidence that's come out in the past few years, especially from the Oxford team, where Juan Pablo Orjuela is one of the members, Christian Brand, and a whole bunch of other people as well, is that active transport not only saves your health and your life, it could save the planet. And it's more effective as a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy by many magnitudes than electrification of vehicles or most of the other solutions on the table. And we're not seeing active transport in climate change mitigation programs and plans. That's a huge problem. So that's one of the things that we're interested in. The second one is that it's not fear. It's not perception of risk. It's violence. And violence has a social function, and it's particularly present and functional in very unequal societies. And so we also need to move beyond linear. The spaghetti approach, thinking about streets and networks and bus networks and bike networks. We never think about walking networks. The walking network should be the basis for every city, and that should actually be on the natural network of natural wetlands, rivers, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a whole other area of planning and land use. It's very interesting. But mostly it needs socio-political methodologies. So some of the implications for land use and how we put this to work. We need to stop thinking about multimodality. Bogotá is a multimodal city. All the modes are here, or almost all of them. But it's not intermodal. I can't ride my bike, and if I get sick or if it starts to pour with rain, put my bike on a bus and get home without getting wet. Or if someone gets sick, or if I have to accompany them or whatever. There's very little progress, if any, in intermodal walk, bike, bus transportation. And that's huge, right? How can bus companies and bus planners and bus agencies or public transport agencies not think about walking? Without walking, they have no customers. And yet they oblige women, in particular, to walk sometimes with physically disabled children or adults. They have to walk through dangerous parts of their city or their neighborhood, to wait at lonely bus stops where I've got photographs from the security cameras of them, being chased by guys with pistols, trying to rob them, etc. Plan for this, guys. Gender, safety, security is a part of your mobility system. So we start from the premise that walking is the cornerstone and cycling is the missing link. And we use this a lot. This is a practical tool that can help to ground these kinds of decisions in planning. We did this with Alex Karner in 2015, 2016, and now there's quite a few versions of it coming out, and I think that's really important because it's really important to look at capacities and to set goals based on people's capacities and what's realistic to expect. I think it was a presentation about Bogotá that said they wanted to get 75% of short trips into walking, and that's a really interesting goal, and you can relate it to others. But cycling is really important too. Everyone studies women in cycling and say, oh, hey, women don't cycle as much as men, huh? That's just kind of normal, or, oh, isn't that too bad, or how could we, no, we don't even really get to how could we get more women. No, you're denying women's right to the city when you don't have a city that's safe for women and children to cycle in. You're denying their right to move safely, freely, comfortably, with their children, with their luggage, with the things they're shopping for, etc. This is a major equity problem that women are walking so much and cycling so little, especially in poor areas. And especially when we talk about cycling, we're not just talking about a personal private vehicle. We're talking about bike share, we're talking about bike taxis, we're talking about cargo bikes, etc. And unfortunately, even with bike share, we're not talking about gender. This is my typical loads in a week, well, except for the cartonero, who's a recycler. But, you know, I have to take my cat to the vet, I go shopping, this is the stuff on my bike, I do other things, I have a garden, I have to buy plants and so on. Bike share doesn't do that. In very few places do they even have seats for children. So these are some of the sort of philosophical or values-based or research-based, evidence-based foundations that we use. And so I'm going to go a little more quickly through this for foundations for planning, but there are sort of two ways of putting this to work. Where are we going here? Yeah. So this is something we did with Alex as well, and I've noticed a lot that for a lot of cities, they'll say, you know, over 50% of motorized trips are by car. Again, we were one of the first teams to do this. And it was interesting because we contrasted San Francisco and Santiago. It would be hard to think of two more different cities. And yet the rates of cars being used for very short distances of travel were very similar. So, of course, what we didn't say was the rates of motorized public transport for very short distances is also a problem. And we actually, in our overcrowded transport systems in the global south, we actually do need to get people off the buses for short trips. So again, when you build Transmilenio and you just put it beside the car lanes and you don't improve the walking spaces and you don't regreen the city because walkers need green, I think almost every presentation in the last few days has come up with green as really a central value for transport and land use planning. But we're not putting that into action in our mobility. So you can set targets based on current modes and where you would like them to go. And we're seeing this a bit more now. It could be more based on current modes and so on. But there should also be land use targets based on this. If cars are only moving 25% of trips, is a high rate in Santiago, and we want them down to 10%, then why are we giving them 90% of the roads and part of our public spaces and plazas and so on? We have to define land use. And when you see the cities, they're usually small and medium cities that have done this really well, like Houten in the Netherlands. What you see is that what they've gained is space. Their neighborhoods, the 80,000 Houten development, which was a new suburban development developed over the past 40 or 50 years, by not having space for cars to circulate, they can go in and out. It's a bit like the super manzanas, the super blocks from Barcelona. Cars can go in and out, but they can't circulate within the urbanized area, which is both residential and commercial and connects to the train. So what they've gained is they have lakes, they have wetlands, they have beautiful housing. The children, to watch those children go to school without a care in their bodies, none of the fear, none of the anxiety. 2 kids on a bike, 3 kids on a bike, they're just having fun, they're totally safe. They're autonomous, which is really meaningful, again, for women and for caregivers, for parents. When children can go to school on their own, that frees up their parents as well, and particularly women. So these are kinds of what our transportation targets should be associated with land use targets. So now I am going to go ahead a little faster. Just say that walking is a real issue because it's really sustainable. But when women, as you can see here, we have really high rates of women walking in many of the districts within metropolitan Santiago, up to 80%. And of course, they're low-income women, and so they have very little access to work, to culture, to cheaper stores, to education, to everything that comes with that. And something similar happens with public transport, especially when their routes to public transport aren't considered. And this, again, this is Ignacio and I had a great time those few years you were in Santiago doing this work. There's a lot of sort of, well, what is care trips and so on, and we had very good, it's a bit old now, but you get the patterns that these caregiving trips, women are doing 3 times or at least twice as many of these trips as men. But also, a really big surprise for us was these are actually more care-related trips than employment-related trips. So why are we only thinking and talking about and studying jobs, especially in the global south, where these kinds of inequalities are much, much greater? So this is a good analysis to do. If you don't have the data for it, the quantitative data, go out and stand on a street corner. Select your street corners for different kinds of uses, different kinds of users, different socioeconomic levels, different times of day. Very similar criteria for qualitative research that we use for quantitative research. And what you'll find is the results are very similar, very consistent, which always surprised me the first few years we were doing surveys and the other things. So this kind of thing gives a whole new meaning to the 15-minute city, which has been discussed in several of the sessions over the last few days. Or at least it should, because I grew up in Canada, so I have sort of one foot there, and yeah, every neighborhood sort of had a church, it had schools, it had the primary school, you could walk to it, the high school was a little further, now people bus to it, and so on and so forth. But that's not the case in the global south. Cities are extremely varied. And actually, the 15-minute city, if you take it to its logical conclusion, which would really be the starting point for city planning in the global south, then what you're saying is you want a quality primary school, a quality primary health service, a quality grocery store, which a lot of neighborhoods tend to develop spontaneously. You want quality services close by. Those services are much easier for municipal and regional planning bodies to locate. Very hard to define where employment goes. We always try, but it's very hard. Whereas where schools go, where parks go, little parks, big parks, I'm sure most neighborhoods would be happy just to have a postage stamp of a park with a bit of green on it. Those are the kinds of decisions that city authorities in most places can make. And the other thing that you can do, depending on whether it's your national Ministry of Education or health or whatever, or your local city government, is you can have an ordinance that recommends or that even requires hiring 50% of teachers at the local school from the local neighborhood. So that's a mixture of a land use, a transportation, and a social decision. And by the way, in times of pandemics or flooding or drought, it makes your neighborhood more resilient because your kids don't have to get trucked halfway across the city to go to school. It's just down the road. So these are important issues. There's a lot of equity stuff here. But the central one that I would say is that road safety and land use are deeply related, and we don't take that on. So just a couple of points related there on violence. We talk about road safety, we talk about helmets, we do a lot of weird things. But actually what we have is road violence. And we found this in a survey that we did in Santiago, a major metropolitan region, but also in Temuco, which is supposed to be a nice, drowsy regional capital. It's not very drowsy, but you know, you would think people would be happy there and things would be better. And when we asked them about road violence, how they feel when they go out on the street, 20 to 25% said they thought it was a war. A war. We fell off our seats. We were shocked. But yeah, there's actually a high casualty rate from that war, okay? So violence has social functions, and I learned this because I had to get involved in criminology, and you'll see why in a few minutes. But violence exists to control and maintain certain patterns of power. It doesn't fall from the sky. It's not those bloody immigrants. It's not the out group versus the in group. It is a method, a central method phenomenon of social control and response to usually illegitimate forms of exclusion and social control. Wilkinson and Pickett have demonstrated with more than 30 years of studies all over the world, really intensively comparing American states, which is really interesting, that violence correlates deeply and consistently with inequality. And particularly in Latin America, inequality is practically a synonym for our cities. Not so much elsewhere, but in ours, yes. Dealing with violence through collective action in social spaces can help address it. It doesn't solve it. We're not going to, traffic calming is not going to solve violence in our cities, but it will help. And I'm going to show you a very concrete example. And so walking, which we call a micro-mobility, I've been sitting here all week thinking, why is walking a micro-mobility? I guess it's a scale thing because it's more a smaller scale or shorter trips, but actually lots of people walk long distances. But also, it's a macro mobility. It's everywhere. It is the most generalized form of mobility that we have. Why aren't we calling it a macro mobility? It's not like scooters. It's not even like wheelchairs or mobility assistance, although I think those are important issues, important things to look at. It's a macro mobility, so why are we calling it a micro mobility? Strange ways roads go. So this really hit me. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I want to say that walking and cycling are subordinate modes. So if you read walking and cycling's treatment on our roads and in our planning systems, what you see is that we as people who walk or cycle or use public transport, because we walk to public transport, are victims of violence all the time. Just for walking, just for cycling, beep, 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 get out, rah, the taxis who almost hit you when you're riding on the road, etc., etc. That violence is not gratuito. It's not, I am really thinking in Spanish. It's not just because it happens. It's there for social control. And it's there to maintain the subordination of these subordinate modes. So what are we doing with road safety if we don't address that, especially in our unequal societies where drivers are really empowered? A small minority of drivers are extremely violent. The rest are not, and we need to mobilize that. That's why most of us are here. Anyone who cycles knows that most drivers are pretty decent, even in very difficult road conditions. But also, the language is the same. Women who get harassed and who are raped, well, thank heavens it's changed a bit, but we were told we were wearing the wrong clothes, we were in the wrong place, we shouldn't have been there at that time of night, what were we doing, etc. Cyclists get told the same thing. You aren't wearing a helmet, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. It's the same social coding that is used to enforce subordination. And of course, it becomes intersectional if you're a woman riding a bike. So yeah, riding a bike is a right. Having access to cycle taxis is a right. And it's not just chance that women aren't doing it. So there's a lot we can do about that. We always look at these kind of fortunate combinations, and we're trying to get to a version of buen vivir, which I will explain right at the end of this. So this original study, just to say that we learned that strategies have to be spatial, not linear, that accessibility indices that only measure distances are good to a point, but then gender-based violence comes into play. The workshop we did in the center of Santiago, which has to be the place with metro, buses, taxis, walking spaces, cycling spaces. I don't think you would find a place better served by transportation of all kinds than the center of Santiago. And the women all had curfews according to their transport mode and darkness. So automobility, it's been mentioned a few times, and yeah, you can take it as just a generic term, but it's been formulated from a sociological point of view, and I think it's really useful to understand that automobility is an ideology that was born in the post-World War II suburbs of the United States and has been exported in many ways, shapes, and forms. It's an industry. It's also a financial product. After mortgages, the bank's biggest product is loans to buy cars. That's why a lot of the advertising subsidizes gas for the clients of banks, at least in much of Latin America. And it's also a vehicle, quite literally a vehicle for social progress. People will say, I remember a woman doctor in another workshop we did saying, and all her daughters rode bikes all the time. She said, oh, I couldn't ride a bike to the hospital. I need to arrive in a car or they won't respect me. So again, how we accept this kinds of discrimination. So just to go into an example of what we've done with this, cars and crime are a big deal. A really big deal. They're a big deal everywhere, but they're a really big deal in Latin American cities. Cars facilitate crime. They're a target for crime. They're a place where a lot of crime goes on, particularly organized crime relating to drug trafficking and so on. And they make it possible to take over whole territories. So suitable responses. We had a big oh moment. We looked at all the communication stuff, the communications based on the information deficit assumption have failed. People haven't changed their behavior on climate change, and we could say the same about BRT, which is really a wonderful social innovation, and it's never really taken off, but there's still time. We need it. So, and there's also this possibility that so I started looking at history. Thomas Piketty brought out a book on the history of equality, and it reinforced a lot of stuff that I had been looking at previously, and that is that actually, if we want to accelerate the process to just sustainabilities, we have to work with social movements. And right now, sadly, the quality of participation is at an all-time low. This is a global phenomena. There's studies by OECD, some of the other organizations. We are just at the bottom rungs, and I hate to say this. I hate it that I've back with, oh, it's supposed to come up. There it is. Arnstein's ladder, which is from 1969. And we're still down at manipulation therapy, maybe a bit of information, maybe a little consultation, but we're not building citizen capacity. We should be investing as much in citizen organizations as we invest in infrastructure. And we should be outsourcing promotion and other educational related and behavioral related campaigns and programs to civil society organizations. That is, organizations of active citizens. It's the best way to do this, and we've been closing those groups out of the conversation for too long. So, placemaking knows this. We did a review of practice, and every time you always see participation on the list, but we don't see what kind of participation. We don't see empowered participation. We don't see collaborative participation. We don't see delegated participation where our local states or our national governments are delegating important tasks to citizen organizations. So that's two things. It makes those tasks, it makes it easier to execute them well for a series of reasons, but it also brings citizen organizations along with the rest of us. If we're leaving them out of the process, the capacity building process, like these conferences or other, then we're excluding them. So they've gone, for example, from this idea of project-driven, and then they got as far as discipline-led, and then they were going place-sensitive, and place-led, right? That's the local organizations. So how do we do this? How do we do this? So we tried this project, Walking for Joy. I had to add a question mark, I admit, in Bellavista, which is the neighborhood where I live and work, and it's kind of our living laboratory. And I'm also the president of the neighborhood association, so it kind of eases a lot of the interactions. And so it's not about experiments, it's about generating experiences. It's not about interventions. It's about really how do we interact, because we can't control them. And even if we want to, or we try to as researchers, it's not ethical. We have to be really careful. And the ethics are actually quite different from those that many of the ethics committees look for. So we have to be much more conscious of that. We do a mix of action research, which is implementation and action, but also PAR, which is power sharing. There's lots of discussions about this, so I'll just summarize. We consider the importance of positionality. It's not that nobody's wrong, but that mostly you're just getting the view from the hill, or the foot of the hill, or the cycle path, or the sidewalk, or the driver's seat, or whatever, and they're all necessary to come to good actions. So how do we do this? This is Bellavista, sorry. We're in Chile, that long string bean of a country. Since we're in Bogotá, probably most of you know where it is and that we're not part of Mexico, which someone said to me once. And this is a mixed area, primarily commercial, with a saturation of alcohol licenses, primarily residential and fully residential. It was very hard hit by the quarantines. It's probably one of the few places in the world where the kinds of policies of putting restaurants out onto sidewalks was a desperate failure. And it really had a terrible effect on safety and security. So this is just a few blocks from where I live in this, what was this wonderful arts neighborhood. The buildings have been totally plundered. There's the facades, but there's nothing behind them. They were turned into great warehouses for drugs and raves and all kinds of parties. And some of the consequences for security. The drivers, the cars. Are our streets used as public bathrooms? Efforts to occupy buildings in the surrounding area. Someone who was burned alive on their motorcycle as part of a drug war. So this is a neighborhood that's always been a bit of a challenge, but post-quarantine, this is what walking turned into. So people couldn't walk. They couldn't use the neighborhood. Cars took over everything, and it took us 2 years of requesting information by transparency, denouncing these situations, reporting them, to actually get them to start coming back into the neighborhood and controlling, applying tickets, etc. And so cars are a really big part of spatial control, and who controls the cars and the parking controls the space. And since this was taken over by, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say organized bands, except they are organized and they are related to the biggest drug traffickers in Santiago and therefore in Chile. And so what they did was the illegal parkers would rent out the blocks. And so you have this vertical structure. And they would raise, because we've always had kind of informal people parking cars, and it's part of the informal economy and so on. But this is a totally different phenomenon. They would arrive in trucks with orange vests on them. They would start charging 5 or 6 times more than had been charged up till then for informal parking. They would park everywhere, as you can see, even in people's driveways. Not many people have driveways, but they would park there and so on and so forth. So this was a really serious situation. We dealt with it a lot by studying the spatial implications, and I'm going to go a little more quickly over this, although it was really interesting to look at how the parkers managed to take over control of most of the neighborhood and how we managed to push them back by a mix of enforcement and this was a fight with machetes half a block from my house, which was unfortunately very common for a while. This no longer happens because all this area where the cars are parked, and this is their business, we eliminated the cars. We put in a cycleway on one side of the road and these really stupid little posts to eliminate the parking on the other side. And although they dedicate a lot of time and energy to vandalizing them, we have managed to push them back. So we used a living laboratory approach for this kind of intervention. We wanted to empower neighbors, but we also wanted to see if we could generate human agency. So a bit of a little social movement in favor of walking and so on. This is kind of the structure of the research. This is the values, obviously, citizen control and partnership was the main thing. We did 2 projects, the first half of last year and the second half of last year. The second half was with the local health facility as well. Because what we found was that we actually managed to push back the criminal control of most of the neighborhood, but no one would go outside. And people outside is your main safety network. If people won't even go outside their houses and walk around, then you have no urban safety. It's not possible. So we did a lot of activities. We did safe routes in the neighborhood. We did a mural. And then we also had lots of trainings and reflections, always those 2. And these are the kinds of results. It was very controversial. People liked some things and didn't like other things. Some people hated everything. And we thought we hadn't really done a good job. But when I sat down and took the attendance lists, which are kind of the data that we mine for this, the first semester we only managed to get 103 people out. The second semester, with all the activities, we multiplied it to almost up to just under 500 people, which for a neighborhood of around 3,900 people, that's a lot of people to be getting out on the street again, and in the most dangerous parts of the neighborhood. And so just these contradictions, some were delighted, others were furious. They debated it among themselves. I defended a lot, but it was mostly a horizontal conversation. Some neighbors criticized the neighborhood association for painting murals instead of fighting crime. We explained that recovering abandoned places is really central to getting people back out of the road. Some people in their cars were quite aggressive. This was a very small number, but my gosh, you felt it when someone threw their car at you if you were doing an activity with children in the street. And one of the most disturbing things was that because our team involves a lot of immigrants, and I myself am an immigrant to Chile, quite a privileged one compared to the situation today, but also my secretary is an immigrant from Argentina. The racist attitudes were really scary. So what we did was we mobilized all these silent people, that old cliche of the silent majority. People were afraid to say anything. The people with positive values didn't want to expose themselves towards these very corrosive, very negative perspectives. And we managed to get them to do it. And so the results were that, yeah, the kind of communication has to be really personal. It has to really reflect a variety of faces. It wasn't me telling them this was right. It was their fellow neighbors. And I gotta say that the big winner on getting people out and convincing them to talk about these issues and walk around the neighborhood was food. So Juan Pablo Orjuela, I don't know if you're over there, your women in your research, they are so right on for our research in Santiago as well. And we happen to have a neighborhood chef who's wonderful. But the most surprising thing to me was I thought, no, you can't. build, you can't generate, hot start a social movement. That's really, that's a whole other phenomenon and stuff. But rather surprisingly, we did. A couple of the neighbors were architects or painters or whatever, and they put together these images of the way the street was then and how we wanted to fix it up by improving walking and green space and so on. And they went out and got signatures on it, and I signed the letter and we sent it to, as the neighborhood association president, we sent it to the municipality. It still hasn't answered yet, but there are elections this year, so we'll get an answer sooner rather than later. And the amazing thing was it generated, people started doing things on their own. So a group of neighbors started doing a no parking sign, a huge no parking sign to force the people who were illegally parking in their entryways to stop. They did fundraising to complete the mural that we'd done. They put their money where their mouths were. These were people who wouldn't even come out of their homes, and they were collecting money. And some of the artists in the neighborhood contributed. So, and they also even came out to meetings, which was really surprising. So, in general, this really did help to improve agency, activism, people walking around the community. And this year, if we actually went back and did counts, we'd see it's a much more normal kind of streetscape now. So I have some conclusions on that, but I'm just going to jump ahead for the last minute or two to this yikes moment. Because what we realized was this was fabulous and we'd had some amazing results. It was hugely, hugely labor intensive. It was really exhausting. It was totally worth it, but you need to scale up, right? We need to do something more systemic. So what we're doing now is something quite simple. We have very few resources. I'm sure many of you will get invitations to participate, and Juan Paulo has already been in it. He was one of our first stars from England talking about some of his latest research. But it's Bella TV, and it's connected with a school for activism. So we're using the values, on one hand, from the active nonviolence movements that led to such important victories for civil rights in the United States or for liberation in many of the African countries and India and elsewhere. And so looking at value messages, but also connecting them in unexpected ways. So connecting walking and cycling to children's getting better marks at school rather than physical activity per se. This is jobs, not bombs, for example, which was one of the messages in the US. And the need for many different voices. Sometimes we're a little prejudiced. We think, oh, only the expert can talk about this. But actually, everyone from Muhammad Ali to black and white mothers to Oprah herself had to sort of join this huge chorus of voices. And I think in our own, perhaps more modest way, but maybe not so modest given the size of climate change and so on, we really need to be looking at building these kinds of social movements and messages in favor of sustainable transport and just sustainabilities in general. So, because we got to convince this guy. We got to move his heart, his mind, his body, his legs, his family, his street, etc. So just a final note on Buen Vivir. It's very much rooted in traditional indigenous beliefs of several of the peoples of North America and also of South America. There's all kinds of different versions of it. The most developed on a modern, in a modern way is Bolivia and Ecuador. It's an economy based on care and respect for the natural world. It's ways of living together rooted in an ethics of mutual care, which you can see trying to emerge today. And it's respect for indigenous and other forms of knowledge. So that's what we're doing with Bella TV right now. We've done our first 4 episodes, and we're going to complete 2 more and then start packaging them and figuring out what we've got. It's a huge partnership at this point. Really wonderful people and organizations and institutions are going to help us nourish it. To be honest, we don't give a damn about massivity. because there's all kinds of massive communication systems around the world, and they're not convincing people to go out and walk a little more and drive a little less or whatever. So that's where we're at. And I just wanted to finish this because road safety is a land use issue, as I said at the beginning. It's really appalling what people face, the war that goes on every day on our roads that kills and cripples people. And we need to be much more proactive about it and stop saying, as I used to say, oh, that's road safety, I don't do road safety. Yeah, now I do. I do. We all have to. So thank you very much to all of you for listening, and I hope enjoying at least parts of the talk. And I just want to thank a lot of the people I've worked with on this, especially the Neighborhood Association.
Thank you very much, Leigh, for this wonderful presentation. As we have only time for 2 or 3 questions and comments.
You.
Thank you so much for this inspiring presentation, as always. Gracias, Lake. Involving in planning and implementation and how to make things happen, as an engineer, I have faced all my career the opposition rather than the building together. It's much easier for community to organize to oppose, and you organize to oppose at some point of your activist career. How to really make things happen when there are those special interests that are opposing but not necessarily benefiting the majority?
Well, the first thing is don't insult them by calling them NIMBYs, because often they are defending legitimate interests. The NIMBY label is very specific to specific conflicts in the United States where it potentially was a little more and is a little more justified. White landowners defending themselves against black integration and so on and so forth. But that's really not the dynamic. We talked about this in Susan's book club a little bit. It's bring people into the conversation very early. We should be having citizen organizations here. We should be funding citizen organizations at the same level or a similar level, an equivalent level to building infrastructure and planning and so on. Because it's true, if they don't have any resources, if we're always living on crumbs, we're not developing really well unless we have privileges like I had of going to university and doing a master's and a doctorate after I'd been doing activism for a long time. So, and there also is, doing genuine citizen participation is not a checklist. It's not just sitting around talking. There are huge theories and debates about it. You need training, you need formation, and you need experience in it. There is a science, and there is an art, and there's an ethics to it. And lots of people like to dabble in it, and they do okay, but they tend to generate more frustration in the medium to long term than genuine strategic conviction for change. That's in a nutshell. There's a lot more, but that's, and the last thing I would say though is that people tend to treat participation as a technical exercise. Oh, we'll use some Post-its, or it's basically a survey applied in person. And we really shouldn't be doing that. We should really be doing participation based on democratic theory and participatory democracy, which is a very specific area, which is a huge literature to it, and we need it. We need it a lot because it's very imperfect, but it's the best we have in terms of avoiding those conflicts or dealing with them more effectively.
Thank you so much for a great talk. You mentioned that the level of participation worldwide is going down, and I would speculate that part of the reason for that is the increased importance of social media, the decreased involvement, particularly of younger folks, as compared to previous generations in face-to-face interactions, these sorts of things. And the methods that you've described are, in some sense, consistent with a long literature of such sorts of methods. But we do have these really important secular changes happening across the world that are probably reducing the extent to which those methods can be successful. And so you're talking about this new project, which is, it sounds like a bit more media focused or something like that. I'm just curious to hear from you how you think the success of these sorts of methods is changing over time due to these other secular changes, and how you see yourself trying to do things like, I don't know, incorporate social media or electronic networks into the work that you do. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good observation. And what I would add is we have to invest in citizen participation, and that in the organizations, not just events or activities. We need continuity. We need voices that are as well informed from a citizen perspective as ours. And what we're seeing worldwide is, one, democracy is under attack. In many places, there are huge democratic deficits, and bringing citizens into the participation is part into opinion and decision making is part of democracy. If you look at the Netherlands, for example, and their cycling miracle, their cycling inclusive miracle, if you really look at the socio-political phenomena, and they've only recently really started publishing books documenting this, but number one, they were one of the most democratic countries in the world starting at the beginning of the last century. Number two, they were trying to repay a population that had suffered horribly from World War II, and were trying to rebuild it and repay some social debts for inclusion and so on. And number three, if you look at the way cycling advocacy worked and continues to work largely in the Netherlands, what you see is we're constantly democratizing city planning structures. It was a very dynamic thing. It's not that they had a wonderful democracy to start and then they just plugged in cycle inclusion. The social movements and the social organizations that concentrated into the Fietsersbond, the National Cycling Union, played a major role in democratizing planning, as did the anti-highway movements in the United States, which are also really well documented, and in Canada as well. They really took on planning powers that were very pro-car. Jane Jacobs is always cited, but there were movements all over North America. And in our case as well, in Santiago, it's where I learned urban planning in the first place, and transport planning. So just to summarize, what I think is a really interesting field for further research is that, yeah, not only are we not doing participation well according to the tenets of the 20th century, but the kind of participation we need for the 21st is not so clear. There isn't a clear, straightforward formula. But what we do need to do is bring organizations into the whole process and fund those organizations as a legitimate part of the planning and implementation and evaluation cycle. That much I do know. Way up at the back there.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Lake. It was a very interesting, and I've got a lot of ideas from the presentation. We are working on the project to understand the adaptation capacity of women to address hot weather conditions in Delhi when they are commuting. Now, when we took this project with the local government and the state government, they were aversive to this whole idea because they said, why are you looking at women? Women don't travel.
Wow.
Now, that was one. Second, when we started engaging with the respondents and doing in-person surveys, a lot of women, particularly from lower income group and especially mothers, they never recognize that they travel. So, quoting one of the examples, not taking much time, but when we asked her that, okay, what did you do yesterday? She started with all the household chores that she has been doing. And suddenly she says that I received a call from the school and I went to the school, picked up my child and took the child to the doctor. They were total 4 trips, 2 kilometers of travel requiring 2 hours on road. And she didn't realize that it's a trip. So that's another challenge. Third, as part of this project, we want to go for co-designing. And now what we are hearing is that when we ask parents to come forward for co-designing the streets, how many of them are really going to participate? And is there going to be a repeated participation? Because there is lack of trust that even if they are going to come up with the solutions, the governments are going to adopt it. So, I mean, I would like to invite your views, and maybe we can discuss this over the coffee and later on how to go about it.
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is you're right on the button in terms of the issues and the invisibility. And again, it's intersectional, right? It's women, but it's low-income women, but it's also low-income women who walk or who depend on cycle rickshaws or whatever. And there was that huge movement to eliminate cycle rickshaws for a while, about 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It fortunately got defeated. But there's... What I would say is, the second thing is, a lot of my thinking about transportation comes from working a few years back, for many years, with Anvita Aurora from Delhi. And one of the things she told about was how they did a program to teach women to cycle. And these women could then clean. They were cleaning houses. They could clean 3 times the houses in a day because they could cycle. So their income tripled just because they had access to a bicycle. So these are really vital social equity issues. And they all are also a question of political power. And our research on walking, for example, and our around the world is that the reason walking isn't the center of planning is largely because the people who walk in many places, if not most places, they don't matter to planners. They're not part of the elite. Sometimes they're not even considered human. They're certainly not considered people with rights and so on. So again, the participatory thing, you know, not just giving a solution, pink subway cards or pink buses, but really going deeper. And I'll just finish there saying, you know, poor people at Transantiago, who I always interact with and love very, very deeply. They've done some wonderful, amazing things in very difficult circumstances. But a few years back, they used to say, well, we can't solve all the problems of society. But the problem is that gender has a huge role, and mobility has a huge role in social exclusion. And that has to change, and transportation is the #1 way of doing it. And land use is transportation's right-hand partner.
Thank you again, Lake. Just a few announcements, as always. We have tonight our gala dinner, but before that we have a ceremony of closure, which is not in this place. We have another auditorium that I will tell you later. And we also have 3 very nice workshops. One is the presentation for pick one, the best paper based on PhD thesis. We have another one about the South-South research collaboration, which are completely invited. And we have also a very interesting workshop on charts to Professor Eric Berhel. It's regarding it's sponsored by the Lincoln Institute and Land Use Policy. So that's it for now. The coffee and the snacks are waiting for you. Thank you.